I knew the HOA was bad, but I didn't realize just how dangerous they could be until the night I almost lost everything. It all started when I got home from a brutal 12-hour shift at the hospital. As an ER nurse, I was used to chaos, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw in my driveway. A massive wooden fence cheaply built and completely out of place now blocked my emergency exit door. My stomach twisted. That door wasn't just for convenience. It was the secondary exit required by code, leading directly to the alleyway in case of fire. I dropped my bag and marched straight to the HOA president's house. Her name was Karren Whitmore, and she was exactly what you'd expect mid-50s, sharp bob haircut, and a permanent scowl that made it clear she enjoyed lording over the neighborhood like a self-appointed queen. I knocked twice before she flung the door open, arms crossed. "Victoria," she said, dragging out my name like it was an insult. "What seems to be the problem?" "You know exactly what the problem is," I shot back. "That fence you put up blocks my emergency exit. If there's a fire, I can't get out." Karren gave me that smug, patronizing look she always did when she thought she was in control. "Oh, that. The board decided it was necessary to maintain the uniformity of the neighborhood. Your exit door faces the alley, and we can't have unsightly doors ruining the aesthetic." I could feel my pulse in my temples. "You do realize that blocking an emergency exit is illegal, right?" "You're endangering my life." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, please, just use your front door like everyone else. If you have a problem, bring it up at the next HOA meeting." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my rage in check. "Take it down, Karren, now," she just smiled. "You'll have to file a formal request. Until then, the fence stays." I clenched my jaw. I could already tell that arguing with her was pointless. She thrived on power trips, and right now she thought she had me trapped, but she had no idea who she was messing with. I walked away, but I wasn't backing down. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. And this time, I was taking it to court. I wasn't about to let Karren's power trip put my life at risk. That fence had to come down, and if she thought she could bury me in paperwork and delays, she had another thing coming. The first thing I did when I got back inside was document everything. I took pictures of the fence from every angle, making sure to capture how it directly blocked my emergency exit. Then, I went inside and printed out the city's fire code regulations. It didn't take long to find the section that explicitly stated that all residential emergency exits had to remain unobstructed. Karren had violated the law, and I had the proof to back it up. I wasn't just planning to take this up with the HOA, I was going straight to the city. The next morning, I drove to the municipal building and filed a formal complaint with the fire marshal's office. The clerk at the desk, a tired-looking man in his 40s, barely glanced up as he took my paperwork. But when I pointed out that the obstruction violated fire safety codes, his demeanor changed. He straightened up, took the documents, and nodded in understanding. "This looks serious," he said. "Blocking an emergency exit is a major violation. We'll send someone out for an inspection." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. 2 days later, I was sitting in my living room when I heard voices outside. I peeked through my blinds and saw a fire marshal and a city inspector standing in front of the fence, their expressions unreadable. Karren stood next to them, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. I grabbed my phone and walked out, just in time to hear the fire marshal speaking. "This is a clear violation of municipal code," he said. "This fence blocks a designated emergency exit, which is illegal under fire safety regulations." Karren's lips pressed into a thin line. "That exit isn't necessary. She has a front door." The fire marshal didn't look impressed. "Fire code doesn't work like that. Secondary exits exist for a reason. If this house catches fire and that door is blocked, the homeowner has no way out." I didn't bother hiding my satisfaction. Karren was used to throwing her weight around, but she was out of her depth now. "I'm not taking it down," she snapped. "This was a board decision. She needs to submit a formal request if she wants it removed." The city inspector adjusted his clipboard. That won't be necessary. The fence is illegal. You have 72 hours to remove it, or the city will fine the HOA for every day it remains standing. Karren's face turned red. You can't do this. The fire marshal didn't even blink. Actually, we can and we will. If it's still here after 72 hours, we'll escalate this matter to the city attorney. I crossed my arms. Looks like you have some decisions to make, Karren. She shot me a glare that could have melted steel, but I didn't care. She'd pushed her luck too far, and now she was paying the price. The officials left soon after, leaving Karren standing on the sidewalk, seething. I half expected her to storm off, but instead she turned to me, her voice low and venomous. You think you've won, she hissed. This isn't over. I met her gaze without flinching. No, Karren, it is over. Take the fence down. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched back to her house, slamming the door behind her. But I knew Karren well enough to realize she wasn't going to give up that easily. She'd lost this battle, but she wasn't done playing her games, and I had a feeling she was about to make things even worse for herself. The 72-hour deadline passed, and not a single board member lifted a finger to remove the fence. I wasn't surprised. Karren had been humiliated in front of city officials, and knowing her, she would rather pay fines than admit she was wrong. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't going to let this drag out. I had a plan, and I was ready to escalate things. On the morning of the fourth day, I drove to the city attorney's office. I'd already called ahead, so when I arrived, I was directed straight to an assistant attorney named Mark Caldwell. He was in his late 40s, sharp-eyed, and no nonsense. When I handed him my documentation, he flipped through it without a word, nodding occasionally. Once he reached the fire marshal's notice, he looked up. This is serious, he said. They were given a legal order to remove the obstruction, and they ignored it. I confirmed it, and he tapped his pen against the desk thoughtfully. We don't take fire code violations lightly, he continued, especially when there's a documented risk to life. If the HOA refuses to comply, we can escalate this to a civil lawsuit and force compliance through the courts. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I left his office feeling more confident than ever. Karren thought she could stonewall me, but she had no idea what she was about to walk into. That evening, I returned home to find a letter taped to my front door. The HOA had fined me $500 for unauthorized complaints to city officials. I laughed out loud. It was a desperate move and an illegal one. They had no authority to fine me for reporting a fire hazard, and the fact that they even tried told me they were starting to panic. I didn't waste time. I took the letter straight to Mark Caldwell. When he read it, his expression darkened. This is retaliation, he said flatly. They're trying to intimidate you into dropping your complaint. I asked what could be done about it, and he leaned back in his chair. We'll add it to the case, he said. HOAs have authority, but they're not above the law. Issuing retaliatory fines is a violation of state statutes. This just makes our case stronger. 2 days later, a process server knocked on Karren's door and handed her a thick stack of legal documents. I watched from my porch as she flipped through them, her face going pale. The lawsuit was official, and she knew it. That night, the fence was torn down. I expected relief, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Karren was the type to retaliate in ways that weren't always obvious. Sure enough, the very next morning, I woke up to find my trash cans missing, my mailbox stuffed with HOA violation notices, and a warning that my lawn was out of compliance, despite the fact that I had hired a landscaping service just last week. She was trying to make my life miserable, but she didn't realize I was already 10 steps ahead. I called my lawyer, who advised me to document everything. I installed security cameras to catch any further harassment and made copies of every bogus violation notice. Then, I started talking to my neighbors. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one Karren had targeted. One woman, An elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson told me that Karren had fined her for having a bird feeder in her backyard. Another neighbor, a veteran named Jake, revealed that Karren tried to force him to repaint his house because she didn't like the shade of blue he chose even though it was within the approved color palette. The more stories I collected, the clearer it became. Karren wasn't just a power-hungry control freak. She was running the HOA like a dictatorship, using fines and intimidation to keep everyone in line. So I did what any rational person would do. I organized a recall vote. With the lawsuit looming and the neighbors finally realizing they had the power to fight back, Karren's reign of terror was about to come crashing down. With the lawsuit hanging over Karren's head and the neighbors finally waking up to her tyranny, the recall vote was gaining momentum. But I wasn't naive. Karren wasn't going to go down without a fight. She had spent years turning the HOA board into her personal empire, and she wasn't about to give it up willingly. I spent the next few days knocking on doors, gathering signatures, and listening to horror stories from residents who had been too afraid to speak up before. The common theme was fear of fines, fear of retaliation, fear of being targeted. Karren had built her power on intimidation, but now that people saw she could be challenged, the tide was turning. One evening, as I was collecting the last batch of signatures, I noticed a black SUV idling at the end of my driveway. The headlights were off, but I could see the faint outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat. My gut told me exactly who it was. I didn't react. Instead, I pulled out my phone and casually snapped a picture. The SUV peeled away a few moments later, disappearing down the street. The next morning, I checked my security footage. Sure enough, the vehicle had been parked near my house for over an hour, just sitting there. I wasn't intimidated, but I wasn't going to ignore it either. I forwarded the footage to my lawyer, along with a note. Let's add stalking to the list. By the end of the week, I had enough signatures to force the recall vote. I submitted the petition to the HOA secretary, an older man named Richard, who had always been one of Karren's most loyal allies. He took the paperwork with a tight-lipped expression, his usual arrogance replaced by something closer to resignation. He knew the numbers were against them. The recall meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. That evening, I noticed something strange. My porch light, which had worked perfectly the night before, was flickering erratically. When I went outside to check, I found the wires had been tampered with. Not cut completely, just loosened enough to be a hazard. I clenched my fists. Karren was getting desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. I filed a police report. The responding officer, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, listened carefully as I explained everything. She took down my statement, examined the security footage, and nodded. "Looks like someone doesn't want you poking around," she said, "but tampering with electrical wiring is serious business. We'll keep an eye on the area." I thanked her and spent the next few hours reinforcing my security. More cameras, more motion sensors. If Karren or her lackeys wanted to escalate things, they'd have to do it in full view of the law. When Saturday arrived, the HOA meeting was packed. More people had shown up than I'd ever seen before, and the energy in the room was tense. Karren sat at the head of the table, her usual smug confidence replaced with barely concealed rage. She knew what was coming. Richard stood up and cleared his throat, his voice stiff with formality. "We have received a petition to recall the HOA president. As per the bylaws, we will proceed with a vote." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karren leaned forward, her sharp nails tapping against the table. "Before we begin," she said, her voice saccharine sweet, "I'd like to remind everyone that this campaign against me has been nothing more than a smear attempt by a disgruntled homeowner who refuses to follow the rules." I didn't let her words get under my skin. Instead, I stood up and addressed the room. "This isn't about me. This is about all of us. How many of you have been fined for ridiculous reasons? How many of you have been threatened with legal action over petty rules? How many of you are afraid to speak up because you know there will be consequences? The crowd responded immediately. People murmured in agreement, some nodding, others outright shouting their grievances. Karren's grip on the room was slipping. An elderly man near the back of the room, a retired firefighter, stood up. "I read the fire marshal's report," he said. "You blocked an emergency exit. That's not just an abuse of power. That's criminal negligence." Karren's face darkened. She opened her mouth to respond, but another voice cut in. "And what about all the fines you've handed out that aren't even in the bylaws?" A woman near the front asked. "I checked. Half of them aren't enforceable." "You've been scamming us for years." More voices joined in, frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. Karren's control was unraveling right in front of her eyes. Richard cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable. We should proceed with the vote." Ballots were passed around. People marked their choices and dropped them into the collection box. The tension in the room was thick as Richard and another board member tallied the results. Finally, Richard stood up, his face pale. "The motion to recall the HOA president has passed." A stunned silence filled the room. Then applause, cheers. People clapped each other on the back, relief washing over them. Karren stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled over. "This is a farce," she snapped. "I built this HOA, you'll regret this." I met her glare with an even stare. "No, Karren. We won't." She stormed out, shoving past people on her way to the door. Just like that, her reign was over, but I knew this wasn't the end. The legal battle was still ongoing, and Karren wasn't the type to walk away quietly. I had won this fight, but I had a feeling there was one more battle left to finish. With Karren officially removed as HOA president, the neighborhood was buzzing. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were now openly discussing just how much of a stranglehold she had on the community. But even though we had won the recall vote, I knew this wasn't over. Karren wasn't the type to go down quietly. She had spent years ruling through intimidation, and people like her didn't just disappear when they lost power. The first sign of trouble came the morning after the vote. I stepped outside to grab my mail and immediately noticed something was off. My car, which had been parked in my driveway the night before, was now covered in deep scratches. Someone had dragged a sharp object across the doors and hood, leaving jagged marks that cut straight through the paint. My stomach tightened. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a message. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. There were security cameras mounted on my house, and I had no doubt they had caught whoever did this. I pulled up the footage on my phone and scrolled through the night's recordings. Sure enough, in the dead of night, a figure had crept up my driveway, something metallic glinting in their hand. The grainy black and white footage wasn't perfect, but the posture, the shape of the person, it was unmistakable. It was Karren. She had been removed from the HOA, publicly humiliated, yet here she was sneaking onto my property like a petty criminal. I wasn't even surprised. If anything, I was relieved. She had just given me exactly what I needed to press criminal charges. I wasted no time calling the police. When the officer arrived, I handed over the footage and walked him through everything that had happened leading up to this. He watched the video carefully, his face unreadable. When it ended, he let out a slow breath, then nodded. "This is clear-cut vandalism," he said. "With everything else going on, it also looks like harassment. We'll open an investigation, but based on this footage, she's looking at criminal charges." That was all I needed to hear. I filed a formal complaint, and within hours, an officer was knocking on Karren's door. I watched from my porch as she answered, her expression shifting from irritation to barely concealed panic as she realized what was happening. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, just a stiff nod before she disappeared back inside. I wasn't naive enough to think that would be the end of it. Karren had spent years manipulating people, bending rules, and finding loopholes to maintain her control. She wasn't about to stop now. Sure enough, less than 24 hours later, I received an email from her attorney. The message was short and laced with legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. Karren was countersuing. She was claiming defamation, harassment, and emotional distress caused by the recall vote and my involvement in reporting her to the city. It was a weak case, and she had no actual grounds to sue me, but that wasn't the point. This was about exhausting me, forcing me into legal battles until I gave up. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, and within the hour we were on a call. He didn't sound the least bit concerned. "This is textbook retaliation," he said. "She knows she's in trouble, and this is her way of trying to intimidate you into backing down. She doesn't have a case, but will respond just to shut it down quickly." I trusted him, but I also knew Karren wasn't going to stop until she had no other options left. A few days later, the new HOA board held its first official meeting without Karren. It was a completely different atmosphere. People actually had a chance to speak. Concerns were taken seriously. And for the first time in years, it felt like the community was moving forward. But as I sat in the meeting, listening to the discussions about repairing the damage Karren had done, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. That feeling was confirmed when I got home that night. Sitting in my mailbox was an unmarked envelope. No postage, no return address, just my name written in neat, almost clinical handwriting. I opened it cautiously, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was typed short and to the point. "Drop the charges, withdraw your lawsuit, or things will get worse." I stared at the note, my pulse steady, refusing to let the words get to me. This was desperation. Karren had lost the HOA, she was facing legal trouble, and now she was resorting to anonymous threats. She was losing control, and she knew it. I took the letter inside, placed it in a plastic sleeve, and added it to the growing file of evidence against her. Then I called my lawyer again. "This just strengthens our case," he said. "She's digging her own grave." That night, I double-checked my security system, made sure every camera was positioned correctly, and set up motion alerts on my phone. I wasn't afraid, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard either. The next morning, the police knocked on my door again. They had reviewed the security footage of my car being vandalized, and they were ready to move forward. Karren was being officially charged with destruction of property and trespassing. That should have been the final nail in the coffin, but I knew better. Karren wasn't just fighting to win, she was fighting because she couldn't stand losing, and people like that. They didn't know when to stop. I had a feeling this wasn't the last time I'd be dealing with her. But she had already made one mistake, underestimating me. And that mistake was going to cost her everything. The moment Karren was charged with trespassing and vandalism, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. She was no longer in power, her intimidation tactics were unraveling, and legally she was cornered. But I knew Karren. She wasn't the type to go down quietly. There was still the matter of her bogus lawsuit against me, and despite the overwhelming evidence against her, she was still trying to claw her way out of the mess she had created. My lawyer was confident that her case would be dismissed, but I wasn't taking any chances. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I had. Security footage, city violation reports, statements from neighbors about her past abuses, everything. The goal wasn't just to defend myself. It was to make sure Karren would never be in a position to harass anyone in this community again. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the remaining HOA board members, an older woman named Deanne, knocked on my door late one evening. She looked nervous, glancing around as if making sure no one saw her. When I invited her inside, she hesitated before finally speaking. She had been part of the HOA for years, but she had only recently realized the full extent of Karren's corruption. Karren had manipulated board members, buried financial records, and even used HOA funds to cover personal expenses. Deanne had stayed quiet for too long, but now that Karren was facing legal trouble, she wanted to come clean. She pulled a flash drive from her purse and set it on my table. It contained scanned documents, emails, and financial reports evidence of years of mismanagement and fraud. Karren had been siphoning HOA funds into personal accounts, disguising them as community improvement projects. Some of the payments had gone to contractors who never existed, and others were funneled into legal fees for disputes she had deliberately created. This was more than just HOA corruption, it was outright embezzlement. I called my lawyer immediately, and within an hour we were sitting at his office, reviewing the files. He scanned through the documents, his expression growing darker with every click. Karren wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a criminal. The next morning, we took everything to the city's fraud division. The investigator we met with didn't need much convincing. The evidence was overwhelming, and within days, a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances was launched. Then came the final blow. On the morning of Karren's court appearance for the vandalism and trespassing charges, the police showed up at her house. Not for the existing charges this time, they had a warrant. The fraud investigation had moved faster than anyone expected, and with the evidence Deanne had provided, Karren was now facing felony charges for embezzlement. I stood on my porch as officers led her out in handcuffs. She looked nothing like the woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron fist. The confident, smug demeanor was gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. She tried to argue, shaking her head as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening, but the officers didn't care. They guided her into the back of a squad car, closed the door, and drove away. The neighborhood was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, people stepped outside, watching the car disappear down the street. A few whispered, others just stood there, stunned. Then, someone started clapping. It was Jake, the veteran who Karren had tried to bully into repainting his house. The slow, deliberate applause echoed in the quiet street, and soon, others joined in. It wasn't just about Karren's arrest, it was about the end of her reign of terror. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was immense. The HOA was placed under temporary city oversight while new elections were organized. The fraudulent fines Karren had issued were voided, and homeowners who had paid them were set to receive refunds. The fence that had started it all was long gone, but the scars Karren had left on the neighborhood would take time to heal. Her lawsuit against me, dismissed. The judge barely even entertained it before throwing it out, citing overwhelming evidence of her pattern of harassment and retaliation. In the end, Karren lost everything. Her power, her reputation, and even her home, because once the HOA audit was complete, it was revealed that she had used community funds to cover some of her own property taxes. The penalties and legal fees left her bankrupt, and within months her house was foreclosed. The last I heard, she had moved to a distant town where no one knew her name or her history. As for the neighborhood, things finally started to improve. With Karren gone, new leadership took over the HOA people who actually cared about the community rather than controlling it. The ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules disappeared. People started hosting neighborhood events again. Kids played outside without fear of being reported for violating noise levels. And for the first time in years, it actually felt like a community. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee and watching the sunset, Deanne stopped by. She looked lighter, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She admitted that she had spent years enabling Karren, too scared to speak up. But now she was determined to make things right. I told her that what mattered was that she had done the right thing in the end. As she walked away, I leaned back in my chair, letting out a satisfied breath. It had been a long fight, but justice had finally been served.